Hi, everyone. This is Joel Rubin, and welcome back to Making Sense of the World. I'm incredibly excited to have the most perfect guest for this moment that we could possibly have had just by serendipity of how things work, and also someone who I've long admired, a real leader, a titan in global security issues, on nuclear arms control issues, on NATO issues, and a leader in the national security community for many, many years. Rose Gottemoeller. Rose was, and her bio just goes on and on, many key positions, but including some of the most important ones in the U.S. government on arms control as Undersecretary for Arms Control in the State Department, as well as the chief negotiator for the New START agreement with Russia. And we'll get into that, as well as Deputy Secretary General for NATO at NATO during the Trump administration. Of course, New START was during the Obama administrations. She really spans the whole gamut. You know, Rose, I'm so happy to have you here with us, because in Making Sense of the World, we try to explain in real terms to real people what is really going on behind the scenes. So thank you for taking out the time today to talk with us.
Well, thanks, Joel. I agree. This is a really important day to be having this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it. So back over to you.
Here we go. Look, let's start with the breaking news. Just hot off the presses earlier today, we saw that the Russians are saying that they want to extend the New START agreement by 1 year and are seeking an American response to that. Can you, for our audience, explain what is New START? What's the reason for it? Why is it good for us? And what do you think about the Russian proposal?
Absolutely. Well, the New START treaty, the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 2010 and entered into force in 2011, is the last in a long series of strategic arms limitation and reduction agreements that began back in 1972 with President Nixon and the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement. So we've been on a long train ride with the USSR and with the Russian Federation, reducing and eliminating nuclear delivery vehicles. Those are missiles and bombers, and getting those warheads that they carry out of deployment. Just for a little bit of context, when the first START treaty, the first Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, entered into force in 1994, we each had 12,000 warheads deployed on missiles and bombers. We and the USSR, well, the USSR was falling apart at that period, but that's another thing. Anyway, it was 12,000 and 12,000. START treaty got that number down to 6,000 deployed warheads each. And then the New START treaty has brought those numbers down to 1,550 deployed warheads each on 700 missiles and bombers, what we call delivery vehicles. So it's been a big reduction over all these years of working together with Moscow on these kinds of nuclear treaties. And so I, for one, am glad that President Putin himself announced at his National Security Council meeting this morning that he's willing to extend the New START treaty limits by 1 year. And that will give, I know President Trump is interested in negotiating a new treaty. I think it'll give the two countries ample time to do those negotiations.
Which begs the question, what's it like negotiating with Vladimir Putin?
Well, frankly, I've never been at that protocol level to negotiate with President Putin. I've been at the table,
Yes.
at the far end of the table with the president sitting across from President Putin, but I've been down the table a few. But nevertheless, he is a very intelligent guy and holds a lot of details in his head. He's a very good negotiator. That tends to be a trend with the Russians. The diplomats train very hard. They speak foreign languages. They are very good at following their instructions. They don't freelance. Well, that has been dangerous in the past if they freelance too much. So you really have to work hard to get, I think, to a more practical, workmanlike stage in a negotiation with them. Luckily, with my counterpart, Anatoly Antonov, I had lived and worked in Moscow for 3 years as director of the Carnegie Moscow Center, so we'd gotten to know each other a bit as professionals. You're never friends with your counterpart at the negotiating table, believe me, but we had a chance to get to know each other as professionals, and I think there was a good deal of mutual confidence for that reason. It helped us get into the business of truly negotiating the details, the practical details of the treaty pretty quickly.
Well, this is actually bringing up a question I hadn't prepped for, but just in hearing you and describing things, I really want to see if I can bring in a previous episode we had where we had Ann Neuberger, former Deputy National Security Advisor, and she was speaking about China and sort of the democracy versus authoritarian dynamics and how that impacts cyber defenses and the permissiveness somewhat of democracies and et cetera, et cetera. Can you kind of share your take then, since you're referring to people and Foreign Minister Lavrov has been there for decades, right? In an autocratic governing system in Russia. He's been there forever, and we continue to have new people cycling in and out because of our democratic system. Can you speak a little bit to this sort of democratic versus autocratic governments and how that influences nuclear negotiations from your perspective?
Right. Well, it does. That autocratic tendency in a system does drive more discipline, as I said, and you can see it in Lavrov and the way he behaves, like when he's at the UN and speaking in a major international setting. He will stick absolutely to his official line, even if it makes no sense whatsoever, even if it's laughable. He will stick to his official line and defend it in the strongest and most serious and articulate terms. I don't like the guy. He's not easy to be around, but he is a true professional in that regard. He speaks English probably better than I do. So he can really defend the Russian patch extremely well. So people say, oh, well, we can never get the better of them. I disagree with that, frankly, because our system refreshes itself on a regular basis. And thank God for that. We have this system in the United States that has brought me into government to work for President Clinton and President Obama, our so-called revolving door system. But I've been able to come and go, spending my out years in think tanks like the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, RAND Corporation, International Institute for Strategic Studies in London, that really allows you to refresh your political as well as intellectual capital and to be ready to come back in with some fresh ideas and to then really, work those details in a pragmatic way. People always say about Americans, right? In the past, we've always been the pragmatic problem solvers. We're ready to get beyond the official talking points and drive down deep and look for mutual interest and try to find a solution that works for all parties. So I think that is an advantage. And that's why, actually that kind of brittleness that you see in autocratic systems and brittleness in their high-level officials is what leads, in the end of the day, to their fragility. Brittleness means, you give them a slight push and they can fall apart at any time. So I've seen in the United States system, our revolving door and our way that we renew ourselves on a regular basis, I've seen a great strength for it.
That's so refreshing to hear. It's so good to hear it from the person who has been in the room with the Russians, negotiated nuclear arms deals, understands the value of our democracy. And it's not just theoretical or a sort of political message point. It's real. It's that this democratic system that we have strengthens your ability to negotiate effectively, strengthens your personal capacity to bring in ideas that maybe you wouldn't have had. Like if you're in that system in one lane for 30 years, you don't get to see things from three dimensions that you may need in these chess match kinds of negotiations. So then with that in mind, why would Putin call for this now? Like what's the reason? Why does all of a sudden out of nowhere Vladimir Putin want to make a peaceful deal with the United States?
Well, I've got a couple reasons in mind, Joel, but before I turn to that, I just want to say with a little vignette and with a laugh at myself that sometimes creativity and good ideas can get you into trouble too. I don't ever want to have a president mad at me again because I tried out some ideas during the New START negotiations that somehow landed on President Obama's desk. And he didn't like it one bit. And I thought I was going to get the heave-ho from my chief negotiator position, but luckily some other people who supported my work inside the government were able to calm the president down. But believe me, that's an experience I don't ever want to repeat, getting a president mad at me. So with that vignette, I do continue to believe that our creativity and our willingness to look for pragmatic solutions is a strength of American diplomacy and of our system. But you gotta balance creativity sometimes with also following your own instructions. But
there is a boss, right?
Yeah. There is a boss. You got to pay attention to that. But back to your question.
I think why would Putin push this out now?
I think there are probably a couple of reasons. First reason is he's hoping to distract Donald Trump from seeking peace in Ukraine. I think that's probably the first and foremost reason he's pulling this out now, because he knows, because Trump has talked to him many times both on the airwaves, but also it seems even in Alaska, they discussed getting sooner rather than later to some nuclear talks. So he knows that President Trump wants to get a big nuclear deal done. And so he's like opening the door. He was the one who shut that door tight in February of 2023 when he said he wasn't going to talk to the Biden administration any further about strategic stability or nuclear arms control and was going to halt implementation of the New START treaty. He said Moscow would abide by the limits, but not allow any on-site inspection or other verification measures, would cease to pass us data about their strategic nuclear force structure as they had pledged to do under the treaty. The one who took the really tough line during the Biden administration, but now he's acknowledging, I think, Trump's interests, and he sees it as a big way to distract Trump from seeking peace in Ukraine. So I think Washington has to prove that we can walk and chew gum at the same time, I think, and we'll see President Zelensky at the UN We'll see President Zelensky this week at the UN. He's meeting with many leaders across the UN General Assembly. And so we'll see what happens with that intense diplomacy. But I do think that it is possible and should be possible to both negotiate on Ukraine and also negotiate on nuclear arms with Moscow. That should not be an impossible task by any means.
So from a diplomatic perspective, and because you've got these two high-level, deep experiences on both the NATO side and the arms control side, when you suddenly see a leader, Putin in this case, offering something up on nuclear, does that maybe push a light bulb switch on to say maybe there's a window here to leverage this or to do something with this for the Ukraine file? Is there a mix and match, or is it better to keep them separate?
Yeah.
Like, how does this fit into the sort of ongoing tensions and issues with Russia for us?
Well, I referred to that pragmatism in U.S. diplomacy. Historically, we have always tried to keep nuclear arms control separate from other major issues. And this was right at the heart of how we approached the matter during the Cold War. It was at the height of the Cold War when we had the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. We came to the brink of mutual annihilation. And that really sparked then a long series of negotiations that led to the first test ban treaty. It led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it led to the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement in 1972. So we had a decade there of some very intense work on nuclear arms control, but at the same time, we were at loggerheads with the USSR over the Middle East, over the war in Vietnam, over many issues around the world. Our two systems were constantly clashing. So that's how I think about it. We've got this existential threat, nuclear weapons that we have to deal with. But at the same time, we're not going to agree with the Russians, with Moscow on a lot of issues. We're going to have deep disagreements, and we need to try to work those on a separate track.
I mean, it's so interesting, right? Like, it's sort of always hovering there behind the surface, or right, frankly, for the experts, it's right there front and center, but it's always underneath everything. And so even just over the weekend, I guess Kim stated that he'd be happy to talk with us from North Korea. He'd be happy to speak with us, but he's not going to give up his nuclear weapons. And then a couple months ago, the Iranians, and that we have a question about snapback sanctions on the Iranians not related to their nuclear program. I mean, if you could put a score, I'll put you on the spot here, right? But if you could put a score on where we are right now when it comes to global nuclear threats and the sort of, from an American perspective, the threat level now versus, let's say, 15 years ago when you were serving in the Obama administration, and you could give it a 1 to 10, 10 being the most dangerous, 1 being the least, how would you compare now to 15 years ago with all of these dynamics?
15 years ago, thanks to President Obama's commitment to his so-called Prague agenda, as he said, seeking the peace and security of a world without nuclear weapons in a very deliberate, step-by-step way, but nevertheless, that was his policy. We reached the New START agreement, got it into force. There were other very important efforts the president had underway, like, bringing a lot of countries to the table in his so-called nuclear security summits to make sure presidents all over the world and prime ministers were taking nuclear security very seriously. So President Obama was very focused on these issues. So I would say that was close to the one end of the spectrum. We are, I would say, about 7 now, and it is partially because of the advances in the North Korean programs and the Iranian fissile material programs, but it's mostly about China and China's speedy modernization of its nuclear force structure. The Chinese, at the time, 15 years ago, they had maybe 300 warheads. They didn't deploy a lot of missiles and bombers by comparison with what we and the Russians have. And all of a sudden, we see them starting to build up. They're at 600 warheads now, and our Department of Defense say they will be at about 1,500 warheads by 2035. So they are building more warheads rapidly, and they are building up their nuclear triad of forces, their bombers, their submarines, their intercontinental ballistic missiles that are ground-based. So China's on the march, and that is what has gotten everybody really worried, because we're afraid that before too long we might face a Russia and a China friendly right now, very friendly right now, both deploying similar amounts of nuclear missiles pointed in our direction. This is what we call the two nuclear peer problem. And how are we going to deal with that is a major, major headache right now for people in Washington and for across the community as well.
And so for our audience, just to add more layers to this highly frightening scenario with China now rising, so China is not integrated into any bilateral arms control treaties with the United States. They are, I believe, are they a member of the Test Ban Treaty? Do I have that right? But they're sort of outside right now. And there have been utterances in the past of what to do with China related to Russia, related to New START. And if you were sitting there and you were putting together your white paper for the president, for the Secretary of State about this is what needs to be done to get China aligned and into arms control discussions, what would you be recommending?
I did write about this for listeners who are interested in foreign affairs in April of 2025, and it's essentially my white paper about what I would do with both China and Russia. But my main point about the Chinese is we don't need to panic. We have, as I mentioned earlier, 1,550 deployed nuclear warheads under the New START treaty, but we have just about 4,000 total warheads. So we have what we call a hedge force or a reserve force of nuclear warheads. If the Chinese do try to, we call it rush to parity, try to deploy 1,500 warheads within the next 10 years, we can deploy more warheads. We're modernizing our nuclear missiles now. We can put more warheads on top of those missiles. That's called uploading. So I'm saying let's not panic about the Chinese because they are still far inferior to us, but let's figure out how to get them to the negotiating table. And my view of how to get them to the negotiating table is to stress the necessity of what we call nuclear risk reduction, nuclear control measures that don't yet, for them, mean they're being forced to reduce. Again, they're far below where the Russians and the Americans are. So trying to force them to reduce right now, that's not going to bring them to the table. But getting them to work with us on creating mutual predictability, like communications centers. We have something with the Russians called the Nuclear Risk Reduction Centers, 24/7 communications centers with Moscow, where we can regularly exchange information about arms control treaty implementation.
Even now, during this period.
Absolutely, even now. And these are not even the hotlines that we have with the Russians if really some kind of terrible crisis arises. This is for routine communications on nuclear and conventional force structure matters. So we should do the same with the Chinese. And if we can get them to agree to that, that's a real step toward mutual predictability. That's what we should be seeking with the Chinese now. Mutual predictability about their direction of travel. They need to know about what our plans are for our nuclear modernization. We need to get those conversations moving. But really, Joel, we don't need to panic. We need to pay attention, be aware of what they're doing, but take some time to try to work at the diplomatic table.
I mean, this is such a fascinating moment with China where we have these multiplicity of overlapping interests. We're mutually reinforcing economic activities, decoupling tariffs, the cyber discussion from last week. And I can't help but bring up, and I just have one more wonky defense question to ask you, which is sort of there's some reporting coming out about the shift now in strategy and in defense strategy, moving away from looking at China and Russia as the primary and moving insular to the homeland and the domestic threats, to paraphrase it, that those become the primary objectives for DOD or Department of War, whatever, whatever we want to call it these days. We're not quite sure. But I mean, how does that, when you see that, and you're a veteran of multiple administrations, you're an expert, you've gone inside government, outside government, and you see a shift all of a sudden potentially in defense strategy. What does that mean? What does that signal to you from an arms control perspective about how are you going to game this out? And is that problematic for what you just described as the need to have diplomacy with China, or is that actually helpful for diplomacy with China when it comes to nuclear issues?
Well, in Washington, it's always a question of priorities. So if we're prioritizing defense of our own borders, of course, that's going to be where a lot of attention goes and a lot of resources go. I would argue, though, that it would be irresponsible to ignore our two peer competitors, and not only seemingly China is approaching being a peer competitor on the nuclear side, but their conventional force structure is growing and modernizing very, very quickly. And we need to be able, I think, to defend ourselves by defending the Indo-Pacific. We learned, sadly, during World War II with the Pearl Harbor attack that you can't avoid the attacks coming to us by pulling into an insular kind of approach to defense. So I really do believe that we need to continue to deploy forward. We need to continue to work with our allies. And by the way, that's the great value that we have. We have friends and allies all over the world, and in both Europe and in the Indo-Pacific region, we have allies who are really ready to fight and fight hard with us if the necessity arises. So my view is, and I think many military experts would also argue, that defending forward is far smarter than pulling back under or behind some kind of imaginary defense line and hoping you can crouch there for the foreseeable future. I just don't think that works.
You mean we can't build a nice shield over North America and just reject every single threat that comes our way? That the fantasy of science fiction is not reality. I'm sorry, I just got to say,
Yep.
I truly worry about us withdrawing from looking at Russia and China as broad strategic threats. And I think it signals to our allies that we're kind of moving away from them as well. And they're kind of on their own now, and they get to negotiate in whatever manner they want to. And I think we've seen with NATO, and you were serving at NATO as number 2 at one of the most tumultuous moments in the history of the alliance, where literally Europe across the continent was questioning whether or not the U.S. would still be a member of NATO. Right. Can you share with us, with the audience, what it's like to be an American diplomat working not for the United States government there, but working for NATO, but as an American nonetheless, an American official of repute? What's it like to go into these discussions then with allies who have been looking at us for decades as their backstop, and now all of a sudden they're worried we may not be there anymore? What are those meetings like? How does that feel for you when you're going in and opening those doors?
Well, it was a shock to me, but it was, more importantly, it was a shock to the NATO system. And I'll circle back to that in a minute, but I did want to mention that during the Obama administration, we saw the first invasion of Ukraine with the seizure of Crimea and destabilization of the Donbass in 2014. And about that time, Washington took the decision, I thought it was a wise decision, of course, I was a beneficiary of it, that the United States should try to make the case to the NATO Secretary General and to the NATO leadership overall that the number 2 at NATO should be an American. And I was preceded by Ambassador Alexander Verschbau as Deputy Secretary General. He really, really helped the NATO alliance adjust to the fact that now a country in Europe was being invaded and this kind of aggression could occur again. So he really helped NATO, I think, begin to prepare for what became an increasingly, over the next decade, aggressive Russia under Vladimir Putin. So I give Sandy a lot of credit for that. I picked up in 2016. I, too, was selected by Jens Stoltenberg. And let me tell you, it wasn't easy. There was a competition going on. There were several European leaders, I'm not going to name names, who had their own candidates, and they were pressing them. And there was
their own Americans or their own nationals?
No, their own nationals. That's the case with all positions at NATO. They are competitive, and at a high level, they are. Okay. There's a lot of, I would say, sometimes blood on the floor over who gets the final nod. But it was a competition. and a difficult one, but I
Crucial
was
one.
glad when Jens Stoltenberg chose me, and I was really honored to work with him for the next 3 years. I learned a lot from him. The very steady Norwegian who came to be known as the ultimate Trump whisperer, right? So that was a big help. But it was a real shock when Mr. Trump first came to NATO headquarters in May of 2017, because remember, he was surrounded by these responsible old hands, people like General Jim Mattis, who was defense secretary at the time. And we were at NATO headquarters all reassured that the president was going to be fine. We even saw the remarks he was going to deliver on that first summit meeting. And boy, he came through the door of the headquarters and tore those remarks apart. And that's when he first said, if you don't pay up, you freeloaders, if you don't pay up, I am not going to fulfill NATO's Article 5 commitment. That is the commitment under the Washington Treaty. If one country in NATO is attacked, the others will come to its aid. He said, I'm not going to fulfill Article 5 commitments. I may even withdraw from NATO. And if you can imagine the upset and hysteria among the NATO member states in May of 2017 when this first happened, it was a very, very difficult meeting. But again, I thought Jens Stoltenberg was very good in saying to the allies, you did pledge back in 2014 at the Wales summit, after Vladimir Putin invaded Crimea, you said you would spend 2% of GDP on defense. And when I arrived there in 2016 and President Trump arrived in 2017, 3 NATO countries out of 27 at the time were fulfilling 2% of GDP, and the U.S. was one of them. So it was not a good show. It was really not a good show. And so Trump was right. And Jens always took that point of view. He said, the president is right. You made this commitment. You need to begin to fulfill that commitment. You need to spend more on your own defense. And so in his first term in office, I really thought, and I agreed with Jens, that the president's short, sharp shock that he delivered in Brussels headquarters was important for the NATO countries to hear and really understand that the president meant business, because we were on the right track when he left office the first time round. And then Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine for a second time in February 2022. So I say Trump started the momentum in the right direction, but then it was Putin and the real threat he was posing and is posing to Europe that drove the momentum harder and faster after February of 2022. When Trump came back into office for the second time, the situation was much, much different. NATO had undergone a sea change in those intervening 4 years, and that's where we are now with NATO really committed to building up its own defenses.
Yeah, I mean, I just also want to highlight this for the audience and our audience, the folks who listen into the podcast, they're people who want to understand behind the scenes what is happening and how people think. And one of the things I try to emphasize is that policy is made by people, right? By like real human beings. There's not some great big computer in the sky that turns out the exact right answer and boom, there it is. And
well, not yet. I mean, we'll see what AI brings us, but not yet. No, I think you have to have people making the policy, in my point of view. That's all there is to it.
If it's computer against computer, we're done for. I'm sorry. Nobody's going to the computer won't pick up the phone to say, did you mean that? And they'll just hit the button.
Yeah, it won't send you a text and say, hey, let's have coffee and try out a new idea.
God, too many computers in decision-making. I got to say, the technocrats, I think about the technocrats and the Elon Musk technocratic mindset. It's really keeps me up at night when I think about them in control of nuclear security questions. But yeah, so where I'm going with this though is that you just basically laid out like multiple years of experience and knowledge and history and nuance into leading up to decisions that you then acted upon. And as a person, as Rose Gottemoeller, how did you decide to get into this business? What made you want to do this work? And what made you so excited about the issue sets to really become the leader that you are?
Well, people always ask me if I had a strategic plan, Joel, and I have to say no, particularly in the early part of my career. I had some lucky breaks, and I always say take good risks to young people when they ask me. When somebody asks you, do you want to try out this job? And you think, oh my Lord, it's too much for me. I can't do it. If it's a good risk, take it. In my case, I had two offers when I was offered a part-time job at Rand Corporation in 1978. I had two offers. One was a secure job. It was a GS-7 at the time to work in the Library of Congress, and I might have had a wonderful career at the Library of Congress. Who knows? Maybe I would have arisen to be the Librarian of Congress.
Oh
I
my
doubt
God,
it,
what a
but
difference this
anyway, it
is.
was a secure trajectory, right? But instead, I was
Mhm.
offered a part-time job at Rand Corporation to work with a guy named Thomas Wolfe on his book on the first strategic arms limitation agreement called SALT I. The book is called The SALT Experiment. I'm sorry. The book is called The SALT Experience.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
I went to work with Tom on a part-time basis. I had no assurance I was going to stay at Rand after this project was over, but I had very good Russian language skills. I'd studied at Georgetown. I'd even studied in high school. And so those language skills were my ticket to ride at Rand. And after Tom's project was over, I got, asked to work on many different projects where they needed somebody who could go dig through dusty stacks at the Library of Congress looking at Soviet military journals. And that became my real expertise at Rand. But the more time I spent at Rand, the more I learned. And that's when I really became convinced that I wanted to stay working in the defense policy and particularly nuclear security and defense policy field. I will say Tom Wolfe was a great mentor. He pushed me hard, pushed me to study, to get my master's degree done, pushed me to write and publish things. So he was a true mentor. And as a lot of people around Washington know, true mentors are very important people to have supporting you.
So this begets the additional question I've mentioned on the show before. I'm a girl dad. I've got 3 teenage daughters. Visited
Lucky
one this
you.
week. I'm smiling because if I'm not laughing, I'm crying, basically. But I did take one to the football game over the weekend, and we won.
Yay.
Steelers beat the Patriots. And so I'm very proud of them. And I always wonder about, how they'll be treated as women in the workplace. And let's be honest, it's 1978, and you're getting pulled into this issue of US Soviet relations, arms control, nuclear. I mean, what was it like to be a young woman in that space at that time? I'm assuming there weren't that many women in the field, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I'd love to hear what that experience was like.
On the one hand, it was a difficult period for women entering into the workforce. But on the other hand, we were right at the first blush of what I call the women's lib movement, right? So there
Mhm.
was, I would say, a lot of expectation that more women would be coming into the workforce. Indeed, Rand always hired summer fellows to come in, and there were women coming in among those summer fellows whom I got to know. So I wasn't by any means the only woman working at Rand and working on these nuclear topics. So that was very, very helpful. And there was a kind of open-mindedness I found among my colleagues at Rand. I won't say it was easy in the larger Washington environment because there was a good deal of skepticism about, well, maybe it was young women. Maybe it was just the fact that I was young and inexperienced and hadn't been in the field. I was an unknown at the point. At that, perhaps some of the treatment I got was because I was just young and unknown. But I do remember going to one event at some point, and I'm not going to identify who it was, but rather well-known person at the time. This is now 50 years ago. I went up and introduced myself and, said what I was working on at Rand. And he looked me up and down and he said, "Oh, I bet you are." Like, oh, there must be something else. There must be some hanky-panky going on here. So I decided then that if I was going to be respected working in the field, I had to be better than everybody else in terms of my knowledge base and what I could offer as a special aspect of my knowledge. And here, my knowledge of Russian language was a door that helped me really get into the details of the Soviet force structure and understand what was going on with Soviet nuclear modernization at that time. Became a real expert working in the area, and that was, I think, very helpful. And when people ask me today, what is my best advice? Take good risks, yes. But if you're a young person, particularly a young woman, and I would tell your daughters this, Joel, it may be unfair, but you have to be a better expert than those around you. People older than you have to be a better expert, and males, you have to be a better expert than the men you might be working with. It may be unfair, but that's just the way it is.
Powerful, incredibly powerful. I know that you are an inspiration to many generations of young women. There are many women in national security now, many in the arms control space as well. I've worked with multiple generations of them, and I know that you're seen as one of their true guiding lights. And so your persistence and expertise and development as a leader really, I believe, created a whole new generation of young women leaders. And so I'm going to share this with my daughters as well. Rose Gottemoeller, you have really helped make sense of the world for us today on so many crucial issues. And I can't thank you enough for being here with us to share this with our audience.
Thank you, Joel. It was a real pleasure. I enjoyed our conversation.